Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I am your host as always, Steve Hall, and I'm joined today by Jackson Peos. So many of you may be aware of Jackson. He's recently been on some very popular podcasts similar to our own, and hopefully you have heard some of his work already. But if you haven't, to introduce Jackson, he is a competitive physique athlete and coach, currently studying at the University of Western Australia, where he's investigating the effects of diet breaks versus continuous dieting in athletic populations. And I didn't want to kind of labor the fact that you'd have been on other podcasts. You've spoken about that a lot. And I wanted to kind of dig into more of your other knowledge and things you've been talking about over on your Instagram, which is super interesting. But before we get into that, is there anything else you kind of want to let the listeners know about Jackson?
That's a pretty good summary, but just a quick spiel. So in terms of my credentials, I've got a double major Bachelor of Science specializing in sports science and exercise and health. Did quite well with those studies and then transitioned to an honours degree. I'm not sure if the university, if you have honours over in the UK or whatnot, but that would be similar to like a master's program. Did really well in that. That was focusing on exercise physiology. Graduated with first class honours in that, and then the university approached me based on my results there, and they offered me a scholarship to complete my PhD there, and that's where I am now. And as you said, my area of research, which I'm really digging into at the moment, is what we call this intermittent calorie restriction, which contrasts sort of the traditional dieting approach, which would be continuous caloric restriction, where the person is just in a caloric deficit every day for the duration of the weight loss phase, whereas the dieting methods that I'm looking at now, it's sort of the cyclical nature of calories up and down, where you will alternate between a period of an energy deficit or a period of dieting with a higher feeding period. And that higher feeding period usually refer to that as a refeed or a diet break, depending on the duration of them. I've got another new study that we're working on at the moment. We can probably talk about that. I actually haven't spoken about that with anyone.
Let's do that.
Eric Helms and Krieger, and they're going to be involved with that as well. So it's going to be a really, really tight study. Also got my hands in a few little supplement studies at the moment. You mentioned spot reducing before. Potentially going to be looking at a spot reducing cream. That sort of this transdermal fat loss agent that apply on the skin to, in theory, sort of reduce the subcutaneous fat layer. But yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
Cool. Yeah, really exciting stuff. I think a lot of our audience is all kind of a lot of physique competitors or people very interested in kind of maximal fat loss, muscle gain. So all of those things kind of pricking many exciting ears. In terms of the study you said you haven't spoken about before on a podcast, can you dig deeper into that? Can you reveal more what that might show and what your kind of hypothesis is?
Yeah, so I won't give everything away. So if anyone scoops me, I'll know there was a fucking Revive Stronger listener. But so it sort of originated with a conversation I was having with Jacob Sheppes from JPS, and we were talking about sort of there's a theory that a person might be able to gain more benefits from a refeed or diet break the leaner they are, or sort of the longer they've been dieting. And that's based on some evidence. For example, we know that sort of when you look at overweight dieters, typically they will have no reductions in lean mass. Typically we actually see improvement in their anabolic hormone profiles. Whereas when you contrast that to a really lean athlete, the leaner they are, typically they become a lot more susceptible to sort of muscle losses. The other adaptive responses to energy restriction become a lot more severe and a lot more persistent. And typically we see negative alterations in their anabolic hormone profiles. So with that being said, we thought, well, it's definitely possible that sort of that what these lean athletes might require these more often, more frequently, the leaner they are and sort of the later they are into a weight loss phase or a contest prep, versus maybe someone who's at a higher body fat, only just started dieting their phase, but potentially they might not merit these refeeds and diet breaks purely from the fact that they might not get as much benefits from them. So how are we going to test it? Well, we're going to take a large group of natural bodybuilders from different stages of their contest prep. So some are going to be lean, some are going to be not so lean, some are going to be dieting for a while, some maybe just started their diet, and we're going to give them a diet break protocol. And we're going to take a number of measurements at different increments. So obviously we're going to have them at baseline. So that's after a period of dieting. Then they start their diet break, and different intervals across their diet break. We're going to take measures of some resting energy expenditure, some mood state, psychological stuff. We're also going to look at sort of recovery and performance and things like that. And what it's going to tell us is going to say, well, do we see more improvements in these markers in the leaner people versus the not so leaner people? Do we see greater improvements in the people that have been slogging it out for 12 weeks versus maybe the people who have only been dieting a couple of weeks or a month? Maybe they don't get any benefits. Maybe there's no improvements from the diet break. And if that was the case, that would have practical application, because then coaches would be able to say, okay, maybe we don't need to start diet breaks from week 2 of our diet. Maybe we only need them in the latter stages of a contest prep or a weight loss phase.
Cool. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I think a lot of the listeners will be along the lines of thinking, oh yeah, the leaner you are, the more beneficial it's going to become. Do you have that kind of, do you think that's going to be what it will reveal, or?
It's a tough one. Like I heard Mike speak on one of your podcasts it would have been only a few weeks ago, and he was sort of saying how it was like, I love Mike and he's very funny, and he was sort of saying like, motherfucker, you've had a cheat life, you don't need a diet break, sort of thing. And like on face value, like that sounds very logical. But we also need to remember that in terms of the intermittent dieting studies and the studies that have used refeeds and diet breaks, they're not on athletes. They're actually on overweight people. And when we've seen benefits of refeeds and diet breaks, they've been in overweight people. So I'm not sure I completely agree with Mike in saying that maybe an overweight person doesn't merit any sort of cyclical nature of their calories during a diet phase, because we've seen benefits in those sort of people who aren't training, who are pretty fat. But I also would not be surprised at all if we saw that sort of these really lean dudes who have been putting the pedal down for 12 weeks, they might see a really sort of remarkable change in some of these outcome variables when we increase their calories.
Cool. Yeah, I can't wait for that research. Do you know when it might come out? Have you got any kind of dates in mind?
So, like, we've only been working on it sort of for the last couple of months, and man, research takes a long time. So what I'm doing at the moment, we're pretty tight on the procedure and the methods. I'm just running through the ethics on my end to make sure it's approved from the university. Once the university says you guys are good to go, then we'll start recruiting straight away. But our plan is to sort of target the natural bodybuilders who sort of are competing in Season B in Australia. So we'll be planning to do the majority of our data collection in the second half of the year.
Cool. Yeah, hopefully that won't be too hard to pull people in, because it's kind of a protocol a lot of people end up using anyway.
Yeah.
You hope that anyway.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping for.
Cool. So you kind of touched on this spot reducing cream, and I've actually seen, I think it might even be someone like Ronnie Coleman has popularized this kind of cream he rubs on himself. And it's like, I think he says he used it in all of his shows or whatever, and it's like an amazing thing. And the skeptical in me is thinking this guy's just being a bit of a sellout. He's trying to kind of just make some money. But I'd be really interested to hear kind of, it doesn't necessarily have to be the cream he's using, but what's that research you're looking into, and kind of how legitimate is the claims that some of these kind of products are making?
In terms of, there's a couple of issues with these transdermal creams and these fat loss agents. Number one concern is the ingredients in the product actually penetrating the sort of the dermis layer and actually getting into the subcutaneous layer where it can actually sort of have an effect. The second issue is, are these ingredients in the product blends, do they actually really do anything? And the product that I'm looking at, that I'm planning to do a study on at the moment, the number one study, the number one ingredient that's sort of supposed to be the number one fat loss agent is this thing called Coleus forscoli. It's a herb. And there's the research, honestly, is very sketchy on it. We've seen some studies that have shown a positive benefit to taking these products. Sometimes they're confounded by sort of the people funding these studies, or the same people making the product. So now, like, that's not we shouldn't straight away say, oh, if they're funding it, then we can't take these research is valid, because if studies don't get funded, they don't happen. So, but I will still say that the research on these ingredients is, I'm far from confident that it's going to have at least a significant effect. It might be minor, but I'm not sure how significant it will be. And the International Olympic Committee, who every few years they get sort of the best supplement and nutritional researchers together, and they do a review on all the supplements. They put out a position stand. I'm sure you've seen these before. And their current stance on Coleus forskolii is, or forskolin as it's also called, is that there's just not enough research for us to be able to sort of make a really solid stance on this ingredient. But with that being said, the company that sort of their product that I am investigating is hugely popular in Australia. Like it is flying off the shelves, and like there's a whole lot of good anecdote and a lot of case studies, but it's always an issue because like people might say, oh, like my glutes really tightened up when I was rubbing this cream. It's like, well, were you also in a caloric deficit? And they're like, well, yeah. It's like, well, how do you fucking know, like, it's the cream or the deficit doing that? So I'm skeptical. And like, I'm not sure, like if I had to put my money somewhere, I'd say it's probably going to be a marginal effect, if anything. But research is sometimes surprising.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Yeah, I think it's always appealing to have something that's going to aid a process that we don't want to really have to work for. So any pill, any supplement that's going to help with fat loss, then, and I guess it's inherent that the placebo effect could be relatively strong with that as well, where people kind of, you don't know what's working towards that fat loss. Probably, well, the calorie deficit we know is this helping at all? That's what you're trying to reveal. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and the way that we're going to set up this study, so like the placebo thing is massive. So the study design that we're planning to do is we want each participant to act as their own control. So because if, like, obviously everyone has individual responses and whatnot, but let's just say, for example, we had on their left quad, they were applying the active ingredient cream sort of twice a day for 8 weeks, versus on their right leg, just the sham cream.
Lovely.
And we've got an ultrasound at the university which can directly measure subcutaneous fat thickness. So I'm thinking we give everyone like a 10% caloric deficit just to standardize the diet. And then the only difference is going to be whether you're getting the actual product on your left leg versus a sham product on your right leg. And then we'll be able to see pretty clearly if we're actually seeing any differences in what this cream's doing. Yeah,
that'll be really interesting. I don't know why in my head the skeptic in me is like hoping that it comes out as if it's doing nothing, but really I should hope that it is doing something, because that would just help everyone lose fat in a better way.
Yeah, that's the problem, man. Like with these supplements that sort of offer these cure-all, miracle cure, like crazy claims and things like that, it's often people get duped into it just because like they become frustrated with their dieting efforts and things like that, and then they just become so frustrated and exhausted that they're willing to try anything, which is why I think so many of these products become really popular.
And actually, to talk about the spot reducing a bit further, I think there was a review there was a study you looked over on your Instagram that I picked up, and it was about kind of doing ab exercise to reduce ab fat. And do you want to talk to that and what the kind of the thoughts are in terms of kind of like increasing blood flow in certain areas to kind of spot reduce and things like this, and whether or not that pans out?
Yeah, so essentially there's sort of this law that to get a six pack you need to do crunches, right? And the theory behind that is that when you're activating the musculature in the abs, it draws blood flow to that area, and it can potentially facilitate fat loss locally, spot reduce. But with that study that you talked about, they actually saw that doing crunches really had no significant impact on abdominal fat or abdominal subcutaneous fat loss. So what that tells us is, unfortunately, sort of, like everyone says, the abs are sort of made in the kitchen, and everyone's going to have sort of these stubborn body fat areas. Now, there's nothing inherently stubborn about them. It just, everyone has places where the body's going to take the fat off last. So it doesn't mean the fat can't go from there. It just means you're going to have to diet long enough to actually where the body gets in a position where they say, okay, well, we don't have enough fat on your arms or your chest or your legs. We're going to have to take it to abs. We don't have a choice. So that's sort of the large finding about that is just unfortunately doing specific exercises on certain areas is going to have very minimal impact on actually targeting that area for adipose and fat.
Yeah, really interesting. I think a quote I like from, I think it was Nick Tuminello, is kind of like, you can't spot reduce, but you can spot enhance. At least hopefully you can build thicker abs, but again, that's a bit under some contention. That's a difficult thing.
Absolutely. Like if you hypertrophy the rectus abdominis, it's going to be more pronounced, and that the abs are going to pop through, potentially giving you a better look. It could potentially even give you a leaner look because the abs are popping through the fat. But in terms of the actual subcutaneous fat thickness itself, it's really not going to do much.
Awesome. And on the same kind of line of thought in terms of fat loss and everything we're talking about, I saw a few studies that you were picking apart in terms of smelling food and the differences between kind of exposure time and the different foods you're smelling, and whether or not there's any practical implications for, like, as a dieter, whether or not you should smell certain foods, not smell them, and how you might kind of be able to derive some benefit or kind of actually make things harder for yourself.
Yeah, that study was super cool. That's a really new one. Excuse me. So what the premise behind that study, and what the authors were speculating before they completed the study, was that some of the signals involved with satiety might be similar through taste and through smell, and that some of the mechanisms might be sort of interchangeable. So what they did is just make sure I'm remembering it correctly. So they got participants and they got them to smell sort of a really like high fat, high carb, really, I think might have been cookies and pizza or something like that. And what they showed is when a person smells it for, I think it was less than 1 minute, their drive to eat the food and sort of consume the junk foods became much higher. But when they had to smell it for, like, I think it was over 3 minutes or something like that, or 2.5 minutes or something like that, they actually didn't want the high fatty foods as much, and they ended up like taking an apple. So in terms of practical application, like, I think I made some jokes about the post. It was a while back, like telling like dieters to go like sit in Pizza Hut for 10 minutes and then go home and like eat a chicken salad or something like that.
I've had my fix.
yeah, but like it's super interesting, and I hope that there's some follow-up research. Like that's probably the first study of that kind that I've seen. But yeah, interesting stuff, and I'm keen to see where it goes.
Yeah, it is interesting because I don't know, they were like, it's out of sight, out of mind. I guess I wonder if that applies the same to the nose, but it's like if you see it or you're kind of smelling it, as it were, for so long, you kind of almost desensitize yourself to it. You're just like, I don't care anymore. It's been there for so long. Yeah,
and I think I made the example on the post. It was like a story of like back when I was a kid and you'd come home from school, like you're coming home from school, you don't feel like cookies, walk inside, mum's got cookies in the oven, like, wow, I feel like some cookies. But like, and that could be that short-term sort of smelling, that short-term smell and sensation and things like that. But maybe if you sort of sat there for a little bit longer, maybe the sort of the drive to eat that food fades a little bit, and that's what the research would sort of suggest.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think it kind of makes me think of, and I don't know if whether or not you would link it to this at all, like the food palatability reward hypothesis, in terms of like, I don't know, maybe a lot of people end up, I guess it's become more popular to go back to like the clean eating and remove kind of the sweeteners, remove the tasty foods later in their diets, because there's that reward hypothesis whereby maybe it's smelling, I don't know if that could be involved, but also certainly eating a sweet food makes you crave to eat more of that or eat more food. Have you seen any research in that, and kind of what are your feelings behind the food palatability reward hypothesis?
Yeah, so like so the last sort of year I've become known as like the diet break refeed guy, and a question, well, a lot of people contact me about sort of their planning, how to do an intermittent diet, how to do their refeeds and how to do their diet breaks, and a question that I was often getting was people were saying, like when I'm on my diet cals, I'm super compliant, super adherent. I stick to my 2200 calories, no issue. Then like I have my double day refeed at the end of the week where I'm planning to have, let's say 2,800, 3,000 calories on those 2 days. But the occurrences of binges and overeating are happening a lot more often during the refeed days versus the diet days. And sort of, I was thinking about it for a while, and I think it ties in really nicely to the food reward hypothesis in the fact that when you think about people when they're doing their dieting days and calories are low, typically they'll fill their caloric quota with oatmeal, potato, veggies, and things like that, sort of very low palatability, high satiety foods. And then when the refeed comes around, all of a sudden they want to start fitting in sushi and cereals and things like that, all these like really tasty carbs, like how many tasty carbs can I get in my 400 grams of carbs for the day or something. And I think that it's causing people to overeat during diet breaks and refeeds because these foods are just so much more damn tasty. They just want to eat a whole lot more of them. And people also need to remember that sort of with diet breaks and refeeds, they are an adherence and satiety tool, but they are not going to they're not going to take your satiety and appetite levels back to baseline. Like 400 grams of carbs you're still going to be hungry after that if you've really been pushing the weight down over the last sort of couple of months or something like that. So my recommendation with that has been sort of try to keep your food selection pretty similar on sort of diet days versus refeeds and diet breaks, and just sort of increase the quantities of them. And I think that's led to sort of a lot better adherence during these high feeding periods.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me because I've heard people say that if they haven't binged on those days in particular, at least the days following, they seem then hungrier than what they were before doing it, which kind of seems counter because like, well, you've just ate more. But maybe that again is linked to the fact that they've eaten tastier foods, and so the body's now driving hunger signals a little bit more, and it's not like because it's kind of counter to what you'd expect. It's like, well, you've just been in a deficit, you've cashed in, you've kind of earned some interest, and now you're even more hungry than you were when you were like in that initial deficit for a long period of time.
And I think even if you are like having those sort of higher palatability foods, let's say on Saturday and Sunday, even if it's not sort of driving appetite up from like a hormonal standpoint, like it's not changing the balance of leptin, ghrelin, and PYY, I think if you go back to Monday and you go back to your bland diet foods, you might feel hungrier just purely from a psychological point of being like, damn, like yesterday was so much better than this sort of thing. And like maybe you miss it a little bit, but I don't know, like that's an open area of research, man. That's a gap for sure.
Yeah.
I think people are guessing about that a little bit at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It literally just reminded me of a client recently got in touch with me kind of out of the blue, emailing me. He would never do this. I was like, I'm really struggling to stay on my diet. I think I need to have like a break. Like, what should we do? And so I instigated a diet break earlier than what was planned. And then he checked in a couple of days later and said, as soon as you told me that I was on a diet break, I was no longer hungry. It was just like, I didn't even need to eat up to the maintenance calories. As soon as you said it, my hunger went. So that psychological element, like I think I've even been there where I've kind of ended a diet, and then the day I'm meant to be back to like maintenance intake or something, I'm just like, oh, I could actually keep dieting. And why am I less hungry than yesterday? It makes no sense to me. But so I think there is that psychological element.
Yeah. And I'll just give you one more example in terms of the psychological tie into sort of these refeeds and diet breaks. I've made the analogy before, and people seem to like it, is like when you're walking your dog on a leash, that would be like your dieting, your deficit days, like the dog stays close and it just walks at your pace sort of thing. And then sort of when the refeed or diet breaks comes along, you let go of the dog off the leash. And then all of a sudden the dog doesn't want to walk at the same pace. It wants to sprint, wants to sprint away as far as it can. And so that would sort of tie into the people being like, once they get a little taste of more calories, sometimes it can drive wanting more and more and more. So yeah, it's a funny thing that there's definitely a psychological component into these refeeds and diet breaks and these higher feeding periods, which is why I'm so hard on sort of putting a ton of questionnaires in my studies that I'm doing at the university, so I can try to understand that a little bit and pick it apart.
Excellent. And another kind of line of interest that's kind of, I guess, has exploded in like maybe the last 5 years is like fitbits and kind of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, tracking steps, elements like that. And you looked into a bit of research in terms of their accuracy and then practical applications towards people using them. Would you like to share just a bit about that and whether or not kind of what the practical take homes from that research?
Yeah, see, the it would be so fantastic if these things were accurate. But unless you're sort of buying a $5,000 Actigraph, which is sort of a 3-dimensional accelerometer, that's what we use in our diet. That's what we're using in our diet study to sort of track activity and NEAT and things like that. Unless you're using one of those, sort of $120 Fitbit, in terms of accuracy, in terms of the accuracy of energy expenditure, we're looking at massive error margins. So if people are using if they're using predicted energy expenditure coming from their Fitbit to sort of justify how much calories they should be taking in, I think that's a wrong move. I think Fitbits, in terms of their application, I generally wouldn't advise going any further than tracking steps.
Cool.
Yeah, because like steps is a rough proxy of activity as well, but I think that's probably the best you can use for them at the moment. Yeah.
And it's like I've had clients at least say, I've weighed in on this scale and I weigh on this scale and this one's weighing me differently to this one. I'm just like, well, we don't actually care necessarily unless we're trying to make a weight for like I don't know, then you need to have the judge's scale or the scale that they're using at the competition. But it doesn't actually matter how much you weigh. It's just tracking what that weight is doing. And I think like similarly to at least tracking steps, and maybe it's off by, I don't know, in a range of 1,000, but at least it's hopefully consistently inaccurate. And so you can use it to monitor activity.
Sorry, the data does show that the accuracy in their step count is far more accurate than their predictions of energy expenditure. Yeah, that's what the reviews have shown.
Cool, perfect. Yeah, I think
because like I've had some clients that have been like, oh, my Fitbit showed that I burned an extra 600 calories today, so I had an extra bowl of oats, and like I just think that's the wrong way to go about it. That's what I'll say on it.
Yeah, it's tricky. You almost want them to remove that because it's just like, I don't know, it's not helpful if it's so inaccurate. Why would you even put the number of calories there? It's doing more harm than good, probably.
Yeah.
So I've kind of gone through a lot of the kind of different questions that you hadn't covered on kind of different podcasts before, but I think it would be valuable for the listeners to hear more about the intermittent dieting. Probably touched on it and people are like, oh, I want to hear more about that. So I think it would be useful to go over it. And maybe first of all, talking about kind of what is, people hear diet break in the literature. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah. So refeeds and diet breaks, they both fit sort of under this branch or this larger term of intermittent calorie restriction, which I talked about before. Now, the problem is refeeds and diet breaks, that term gets used a little bit interchangeably. Sometimes like people don't know if they're having a refeed or a diet break. But in terms of discriminating between the two, at the moment, I think the best way we can separate them is by describing a refeed as a 24 to 48 hour increase in calories that alternates with a period of dieting, and a diet break being something longer, so sort of 72 hours up to 14 days. And I say 14 days because we had some really solid research by Byrne and colleagues a couple of years ago, which was the Matador study. And they were using 2-week diet breaks, and they showed better sort of body composition outcomes and less weight regain using a 2-week diet break method after every 2 weeks of dieting versus just a traditional continuous dieting approach. Now, in terms of how you'd want to sort of set up a diet break, that's another gap we have, because obviously we know that sort of whether it's a refeed or diet break, calories need to increase. But a few things that the research aren't sort of set on is, well, how much should the calories increase by, and where should the calories come from? Does it even matter? For example, if it didn't matter, we could just increase sort of protein and fat and carbs evenly, or we could just increase the macronutrients that we prefer. Now, I don't think that's correct. I think we do have some decent research to suggest that increasing carbohydrate is going to have better more benefits than increasing protein or fat. And that comes down to we know that leptin, which is a hormone that regulates our satiety and our energy expenditure, meaning that when we have higher leptin levels in the blood, we have higher energy expenditure and better satiety, less hungry. We know that leptin is particularly sensitive to carbohydrates. So there's a theory that after an influx of carbohydrates, you might get this short-term release of leptin levels. And when that happens, potentially energy expenditure, sort of metabolic rate might normalize a little bit, come up. Satiety might balance out a bit. And if that happens, sort of adhering to the diet is going to be a little bit better. We also know that when an athlete has higher carbohydrate availability, a few things happen. We know that their strength and endurance performance is better. We also know that they're able to recover from and tolerate higher training volumes. So if you're able to, using an intermittent diet approach, if you're able to give sort of an athlete sort of these influx of carbs across the diet phase, there's potential for them to be able to sort of push through more volumes, recover from it. And obviously we know volume's such a strong driver for hypertrophy. So the more volumes that they can perform is probably going to at least mitigate any potential muscle losses that can occur from the diet phase. So yeah, there's some of the considerations for diet breaks, but as you can probably work out, we don't really have a clear-cut sort of this is how you should diet break, this is how much you should increase your calories. And just going back to the calories thing, for example, like I know that like there's a sort of a spectrum of how much people increase these calories on a diet break. For example, we could go to one end and have like the bodybuilder cheat day where they're like just untracked, just go for it. Like, people still use those, and that's still an intermittent diet by definition. And on the other end, I know that coaches will give their athletes refeeds and diet breaks where they will increase their calories, but it's still a deficit. It's just less of a deficit. And I don't think that's going to do much of anything. And we think that sort of the goal sort of range is to be at least in energy balance. So take the athlete out of an energy deficit into energy balance, which means that they're eating enough calories to at least maintain their body weight. Because when that happens, that's when we start seeing some of these normalization of adaptive responses to energy restriction, this reduction in diet fatigue.
Cool. Yeah, it's really useful to actually have those definitions laid out, because I think within the fitness industry, with lots of different terminology, there's lots of different takes on the point. So to know that a refeed is generally kind of up to 2 days, and I think more than that is generally a diet break up to 14 days. And then for the most part, coming to maintenance intake for that period of time is the goal. So, and then you touched on some of the benefits, kind of talking about leptin. What are the other kind of the known benefits of these periods of time versus what we kind of theorize or hope is going on?
So the benefits of diet breaks in general? Yeah. So we know that sort of with our traditional continuous dieting approach, continuous caloric dieting is only really effective sort of for a fixed period of time, a short period of time, sort of before our body adjusts to it and we stop losing weight, because we have these inbuilt mechanisms that tries to keep us around our set point body weight or body fat level. And like I touched on these before, they call it adaptive responses to energy restriction. And broadly, which the responses that we mostly talk about is sort of these metabolic changes and hormonal changes, these hormones that regulate our appetite. And in terms of the metabolic changes that are going on, we're getting these reductions in energy expenditure as we progress through the dieting phase and as we lose weight. And what that means is that sort of we burn less calories at rest, we burn less calories during activity, and then as we progress through the diet phase, sort of that 500 calorie deficit that we started at week 1 of the diet is maybe only a 300 calorie deficit by week 3 of the diet or something like that. And if you continue with that along, weight loss becomes more difficult, and eventually you'll hit a weight loss plateau. Now, in terms of the hormonal changes, we get a change in balance of these hormones that regulate our appetite. And the key ones which I'm looking at in my diet study, my diet break study, is leptin, ghrelin, and PYY. And as you diet, as you lose weight, when you're in a caloric deficit, you get these persistent drives to eat. You get less satiety, more hunger, the physiological shift trying to get you to eat more. So when we get these metabolic and hormonal changes happening in combination, it's making weight loss more and more difficult, and it's making adherence to the caloric target more difficult. And generally what we refer to sort of these changes in combination is diet fatigue. We also know that sort of sticking to a continuous caloric diet, sort of 12 weeks straight, is very difficult. Sometimes someone might be at week 5 of the diet and feeling pretty shitty. They've got 7 hard weeks of dieting ahead of them. Sometimes they might crack, binge eat, and the athlete ends up going backwards because of it. So there's some of the sort of changes that are accompanying a continuous dieting phase. Now, where the intermittent dieting approach comes in is there's a theoretical rationale that an intermittent diet, so a diet that uses refeeds or diet breaks, might minimize or mitigate some of these negative sort of adaptations that are taking place. For example, in terms of the metabolic changes, we've seen in the research that trials that have used a 2-week diet break after every 2 weeks of dieting, or a 3-day refeed after every 11 days of dieting, and also a 2-day refeed after every 5 days of dieting, all those approaches have maintained resting energy expenditure at a higher level than a continuous dieting approach, which tells us that sort of when you have these short-term influx of calories across the dieting phase, it might just help to normalize energy expenditure and help our metabolic rate to stay a little bit sort of closer to baseline, or a little bit higher. And we want our energy expenditure sort of to be as high as possible, because that means we get better weight loss efficiency. Now, weight loss efficiency just means sort of the amount of weight that you can lose per unit of caloric restriction, or another way we could say it is sort of losing a fixed amount of weight but eating higher calories. So which would be an ideal situation for the athlete. So that's the metabolic stuff. And I also talked about sort of the leptin response to carbohydrate. But what we also see is when you take someone to energy balance, you start seeing these normalization of these hunger signals. So we also think that by giving someone refeeds and diet breaks across their dieting phase, it might make appetite management just a little bit easier. They might be able to stick to the plan. They're not feeling so sort of ravenous all the time. And just finally, with the psychological changes, we think that sort of, let's say, I'll give you an example. My diet break study is giving the athletes a 1-week diet break after every 3 weeks of dieting, and they're going to have 12 weeks of dieting all up. So that contrasts to sort of our control continuous group, which is doing the 12 weeks of dieting straight. Now, what we think, just from a psychological perspective, is that the group who are getting sort of these 1-week diet breaks after every 3, all of a sudden sort of these dieting blocks become a lot more manageable. And it's just from purely going back from feedback from working with these participants, it seems like because they've only really got a diet for 21 days at a time before calories increase, they're not getting so overwhelmed. And even if they're feeling pretty shitty, maybe at the end of a second week of a diet block, they can sort of go, well, I've only needed a diet for 7 more days, and then calories are going to come up, training performance is going to increase a little bit, going to feel a little bit better. Whereas you contrast that to the continuous group, if they're feeling pretty crap on week 3, they've still got 8 in front of them, so 9 weeks in front of them. So I also think just from going from feedback with the participants as well, when you give these athletes these diet breaks, it gives them an opportunity to go and have a social event with family, go out and have Nando's with their buddies or something like that. And I think that like we're tracking mood states in this diet study. I'm so confident that the diet break group, because they're able to do that and they don't feel so socially isolated, they're able to go have a meal with their loved ones. I'm pretty confident that we're going to see better markers or more positive mood states in that group. And what's great about sort of going out and having a meal on your diet break when it's tracked is it doesn't carry the same guilt of sort of cheating on your diet, also an unplanned deviation. So that's some of the benefits that we think sort of an intermittent diet, specifically using diet breaks, would have over a continuous dieting approach.
Really interesting. And I don't know if, in terms of the benefits, is it like if you have 2 days of refeeding versus like a week diet break, is it like, are they cumulative benefits, or is there kind of, have you found a sweet spot in which kind of we've taken enough of a break to get most of the benefits, but not so long away from dieting that we're now dieting for even longer?
So that is such a good question, because it hasn't been tested yet, but we're going to do it in that study that I was just telling you about. Because what we're going to do, without giving too much away, is when I said sort of intervals of the diet break, we're not just going to measure them pre-diet break and post-diet break. We're going to measure them at day A, day B, day D,
Fantastic.
day E of the diet break. So we can actually get a time course of change. So, for example, we might see that maybe 2 days at maintenance is not enough to trigger some normalization in energy expenditure. But after 5 days, or actually we start seeing things track up a little bit. So yeah, that we're going to be able to answer that question pretty soon, which is cool.
Excellent.
But yeah, great question.
And actually, I was wondering, in terms of these studies, is there any differences between males and females in this regard? Like, is there any differentiation there at the moment?
Like we haven't been using differentiation, but obviously the massive limitation when using females is sort of the weight fluctuation based on their cycle, and not all females get sort of the water retentive effect sort of pre-cycle and things like that. And when we were planning the big diet break study, and I was speaking with Eric about it, we thought, far out, maybe we should just do men. But then we thought, if we want this protocol that we're trying to test in our diet break study, we want it to be like really usable by athletes. Right. And I feel like if we didn't at least show that sort of females could get benefits from it too, it's just going to give a disservice to the females, because they're not going to know, well, are we going to respond differently? So we actually haven't treated the males or females any differently in terms of the protocol. But we are going to do some analyses on within the study on males versus females to see that if there is a difference. But I didn't want to exclude, because I thought that was a bit unfair, because it's not like females aren't going to be using diet breaks too, you know? Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think that's really good that you guys are including that, because it's always, I hate it to feel that women feel like they're ever being left out, but there always seems to be, actually, there's way more women getting into this, and their health is just as important as kind of men's health, and their goals are just important. So I'm glad that you guys are doing that.
Yeah.
And then in terms of kind of at the moment, what are your views in terms of kind of a refeed of 2 days, maybe, versus accumulating, say, that 2 day refeed and using it like later, and like, say you had, I don't know, over the course of 3 weeks, you have 6 refeeds, rather than kind of over those 3 weeks keeping in a deficit linearly, and then over the next kind of week having all of those 6 refeeds in one go. Do you right now have a kind of whether or not you think one approach will be better than the other?
Yeah, if we don't know for sure, but if I had to guess, I would think that the 6 days cumulative together as like a diet break, right, would be better than the short-term bouts of influx of calories. Just because I think when you put someone in energy balance for that long, it's a really strong signal to the system that sort of energy isn't in such short supply. And then the body might say, okay, we can start sort of turning back some of these adaptive responses of dieting. We can start sort of reducing these diet fade, because we've got this energy availability is high, and it's been high for a while. So that's my guess.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Jackson, I want to say a massive thank you for today's podcast. I think there's been a huge amount of take homes and really interesting stuff that you're doing. And I have to thank you for that research, because I mean, I'm going to be using it, and I'll be using it personally and as a coach. And if people want to learn more about kind of you, find your Instagram and everything, where should they head? Yeah.
So firstly, thanks so much for having me on, man. It's an absolute honor. I love speaking about this stuff, especially to guys as knowledgeable as you. And best place to find me is Instagram at Jackson Peos. Sort of all my research updates, anything I'm doing in the lab, any new research that comes out, I'll always be pumping it out on there. And if you want to sort of just stay up to date with my research publications, you can find me on ResearchGate as well. I keep that up to date with any new studies and things like that.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that's all linked below. Again, thank you for coming on, and thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.